Okay. All righty. So we should be good. Um, so what I've done is, good evening, everybody. I am dual screening it here. I have YouTube chat here. I got Zoom call here. We should be good to go. Let me put down so I can hear you all. Outstanding. Okay. How you doing, everybody? Good. Not so good. Bit of both. Okay. Um, Let me pull up the presentation. So we have a longer lecture today, unfortunately. The situation is that those of you doing the extra credit know this. What I'm doing is I'm going to do the lecture, and as soon as the lecture is done, I'm going to stop streaming to YouTube. And those of you who want to stick around for the extra credit discussion, don't leave the Zoom call because I'm just going to stop live streaming and then we're going to continue it in the same call. After which I am going to do office hours until about 9 p.m. So if you have questions about the final, you can either ask them in that setting or just shoot me an email, I guess. Last bit of news. I put up a video last night at around 6 p.m. or so about how to do citations. The audio quality is not great on that video, so I might have to redo it. But I had promised you guys that I was going to do that, so I figured I would come through with that. Watch it at your leisure. I've made that not just for this class, but for future classes. I figured it would be helpful. So let me know if you have questions about that as well. Maybe if you haven't watched it yet, watch that after the lecture. Other than that, let's begin. So in our last class, we talked a lot about how the early Cold War is really influenced by, for lack of a better word, tension, right? And this genuine fear that the end of the world is nigh, like the end of the world is about to happen. And this causes some particular reactions in the American and the European public. As I mentioned, throughout the 1950s, the reaction to this was predominantly to ignore it, to pretend that it is not happening, that it is not a thing, and that all social problems are not happening and that are not a thing, in order to sort of, the sort of keep calm and carry on mentality, but apply to, things that people shouldn't be keeping calm about. And this goes well throughout the 50s, but as the generational change happens from the 1950s going into the 1960s, people that were too young. Does this cop car have to go back right now? Like right now? All right, sorry about that. Anyway, um, as the generational change happens between the 1950s and the 1960s, what you see is a change in the attitudes surrounding both the Cold War and their concept of war in the first place. And this is sort of understandable. The generation of the 1950s, that is predominant 1950s, is for the most part a generation that fought through World War II and came home and have a mentality of, America is the good guy. America is the person that goes into conflicts all over the world in order to try to be a global policeman, for lack of a better word. And think of it as sort of like the Captain America mentality of international relations. And I wanted you to think about that when we talk about the Vietnam War and its reactions, because their children, that generation's children, people that were not born or too young to remember World War II, have grown up in a world where all they have ever known is the Cold War. All they have ever known is this overarching tension that the world might end tomorrow. And I mentioned this last time, but this is sort of why the 60s are so different, because as this generation comes of age, you begin to see their processing of it. For many of these young people, this means, well, if the world's going to end tomorrow, I might as well make it the best world as possible, world possible. So let me get involved politically and socially. This is where you start to see the rise of things like the student movement, the civil rights movement. More on that in a minute. And also where you start to see some of the more funkier reactions to the Cold War and the Vietnam War. Things like the rise of the hippie movement, the rise of the beatniks, free love in San Francisco and stuff like that. And also like that sort of darker undertone of that we saw in the rise of the typically American phenomenon of the cult. This is something that doesn't really exist elsewhere, but they really hit their peak in around the 60s and early 70s, partially because of this. You have things like Jamestown and stuff like that really hit their peak in this period of American history. But on a sort of broader level, when we talk about the Cold War, we also need to talk about the sort of larger macro scale understanding of how the balance of power has changed. Because when we talk about the Cold War, we have officially moved away from what political scientists call a multipolar system, where power concentrates in all sorts of these different pockets, different countries all over the world, and focuses into two. And if you think about it, this makes sense, right? Like when we talked about history up until this point, we've had all of these different powers. But after two consecutive world wars, great power wars, these countries, all of them, even England with the geopolitical advantage that it has, ends up destroyed, ends up wrecked, ruined. England destroyed, France destroyed, Germany completely destroyed, Italy gone. And this really leaves only the USSR and the United States as sort of the last two candidates for global power. And in the vacuum, they expand, their roles become bigger, and we move away from multipolarity with all of these different countries that have strong elements of military power to bipolarity, where you only have two countries that have, large elements of military power. And these are the United States and the USSR. And peace is maintained through the balancing of power. We talk about the balance of power when we talk about the Cold War. Why? Well, because think about it. These countries, peace is maintained because both countries fear a principle called MAD, mutually assured destruction. If the United States and the USSR go to war with each other directly, they will destroy each other in the process, right? And it's not just mutually assured destruction at this point, because at the end of World War II, we have, a new technological element in the background of all of this. We have nuclear weapons. And because we have nuclear weapons, it is not just mutually assured destruction, it is globally assured destruction. And so the stakes are very high. And so it is critical for these countries to maintain balance. Because here's what happens when they don't. If they don't maintain balance, let's say, for example, that the USSR gains an unsurmountable advantage over the United States, or vice versa. Either the country that is significantly more powerful now believes that they can win in a direct conflict with the other power, therefore nukes fly and game over, or the smaller country panics and thinks that if they don't overcompensate, they will if they don't overcompensate and shoot first, they will get destroyed. And so it is critical for these countries to maintain balance. So you maintain peace through this strategic armament and disarmament of these powers. But this is not always a flawless process. And we talked a lot in the last class about these various flashpoints that happen in Korea, in Berlin with the Berlin Wall crisis, and in Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And all of these are incidences where, the Cold War could have become very quickly a hot war. We sometimes underestimate how close war was. The Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago in 1954, I believe, creates a metaphorical clock. It's called the Doomsday Clock. I'm sure you may have heard of this before. That calculates humanity's closeness to self-destruction as minutes to midnight, midnight being the apocalypse. And during the Cold War, we got 1 minute to midnight. To give you a sense of why people had this reaction. This is part of the reason. But in all of our discussions, we left out the biggest, sort of most important of all of the flashpoints of the Cold War, the most culturally resonant flashpoint of the Cold War, that being Vietnam. And it's important to understand what Vietnam is and what Vietnam isn't. Because Vietnam is a conflict between the North and South Vietnam, in which the United States and not so much the USSR, but China really get involved. But what it isn't is a war of invasion. It's not like, the United States deciding, it would be fun to do, invade Vietnam. Let's do it. That's not exactly what's going on here. So let me explain. Vietnam is a post-colonial country. What does that mean? It means that, something we didn't really talk about in our last class, and more because this is not a World 2, it's a Western Civ 2. But if you take World History 2, you will learn a lot about this, is the process of decolonization. In that after World War II, a lot of these countries in Europe that had spent the past, not just 5 years, but if you consider World War I and the interwar years in which the struggle against fascism was a real thing, sort of campaigning for and fighting for democracy and liberty, could not well turn around throughout the 1950s and 60s and say, well, when we meant democracy and liberty, we meant for white people. You guys in the colonies, you don't get that. No. You guys stay as part of our system. They couldn't exactly do that, although they did try. And a lot of these people, bear in mind, throughout World War I and II, you have a lot of people from these colonies that are not from Europe fighting in World War I and II, fighting for these causes for democracy and going home and going right back to the way things were. And this didn't really work out. And so you have this huge process of independence movements, which of course is exacerbated by the Cold War because each side wants to get a new country as part of their posse. Right? So you have things like the Congo crisis, where Congo declares independence, and suddenly you have the US guy and the USSR guy duking it out about who's going to which direction the Congo is going to join. I like to talk about the Congo crisis in my 20th century history class. Shameless plug. Take that. But also you have contexts like Korea. Korea is another example of that, right? Korea is also a post-colonial country. In this case, it's a post-colonial Japanese country. And the way they solve it is by just splitting the country down the middle. Concept is the same. Vietnam is one such country. It is a French colony originally. And it is why, for example, as a fan of Vietnamese food, who's had a Vietnamese sandwich before? People in the Zoom chat or people on YouTube will tell you this. Vietnamese sandwiches are served on French bread. It is a wonderful sort of mishmash of colonial cooking, for lack of a better word. I always found that to be really interesting. But much like Korea, Vietnam is also split down the middle, sort of horizontal line. No one asks the Vietnamese if they're cool with this. And it's partitioned into two halves. The north is a communist state, but again, it's not so much close to Russia as it is close to Mao's China. It's following more that Bukharin model of communism that we saw way back when we talked about the NEP. And the South is a capitalist country. It starts being under the control of a Western educated man by the name of Diem, Diem, if I am not mistaken on that, but my Vietnamese is not good. This is more under the United States' sphere of influence. But almost immediately, like almost as soon as this is decided, you have unification movements on both half of the border. And we call this unification movement the Viet Cong. And because of the way the government in the South is operating, the Viet Cong almost immediately receives backing from the North. And because the North is backing for unification under the North, the Viet Cong, not so much an openly communist movement, but backed by communist North Vietnamese, therefore, they sort of have this bent to them. Now, we often associate the Vietnam War with one president and one president in particular, and that's Lyndon Johnson. But our involvement in the Vietnam War happens almost, in Vietnam at least, happens almost immediately. Happens all the way back in 1958 under Eisenhower. And even before then, we were advising the French during the period of decolonization. But why are we there? What's the fear? The fear is something called the domino theory. And you may have heard of this before. The domino theory is this idea that, it's sort of taking inspiration from that Trotsky model that we looked at way back when, that if a country falls to communism, that its neighboring countries will sort of quickly, like dominoes, fall one on top of the other until eventually they're all communist. Because when one country falls to communism, this sort of pushes the local communist movements and galvanizes them to getting really involved. And this is a bit of a reductive map of the domino theory. But sort of larger maps of the domino theory include places like the Philippines and, more importantly, India. Now we forget this, but when the partition of India happens, again, we cover that in world history, not so much here, but for context, the partition of India is when the India splits up into the countries that we now know as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and mainly along religious lines. But when the partition happens, the United States is actually closer to Pakistan, and India under Nehru is more third way, kind of like, winking, flirting with the Soviet Union, but not quite making that step. And so there is a genuine fear that if India falls to the Soviet Union, if India falls to communism, and you have a scenario in which the world's largest country, Russia, and the two largest population centers in the world, China and India, all follow communism, that is a point of no return. And that is, again, one of those insurmountable advantages that the USSR might get, and therefore lead to war. That's the fear. And so this idea is we hold ground in South Vietnam to sort of isolate communism to this area. And again, I have to bear in mind, this is part of the thing we talked about last time, Khrushchev's grand vision for creating crises, right? Because Khrushchev is not just expanding communism here in South Vietnam, but he's doing it in all the post-colonial contexts. He's doing it in South America, he's doing it in Africa, he's doing it in Central Asia. And because of that, there is this idea that the United States will become so stretched. All of this stuff links together. But there is this genuine fear that this is the tipping point. Of all of the global conflicts, Vietnam is going to be that tipping point, and that it cannot fall, or at least South Vietnam, cannot fall to the South. The North is often referred to as Hanoi, and the South is often referred to as Saigon. Concept is the same. And while we get involved in the 1950s, it becomes apparent that the United States would need to become involved in more than just an advisory role. Because here's what happens. You may have heard this expression before, that the United States backs into Vietnam. That the United States didn't necessarily want to go to Vietnam, but yet somehow found itself in Vietnam just by virtue of backing into it. Here's what we mean. The earliest conflicts of the Vietnam War between the North, the Viet Cong, and the South, the Army of the South shows itself to be, for lack of a better word, profoundly inept. They don't know what they're doing, and this sort of makes sense, right? These were people that until very recently had fought war guerrilla style, had fought war against colonial invaders, and never like a formal war between here's one side, here's the other side, go attack them, and certainly not with the level of armaments that the United States was funneling into the country. For many of these people in South Vietnam, they'd never even seen a helicopter before, and now suddenly they're being shown how to fly one. The first engagements of the Vietnam War in the latter part of the 1950s are disasters. Most casualties for context, as an example, most casualties of the early part of the Vietnam War among the South Vietnamese are from friendly fire. People not knowing what they're doing, and so they're shooting at each other. This is the level. And so the United States says, okay, well, we can't get involved directly. We can't put boots on the ground. But what we can do is we can provide aerial support. Now, it may come as a shock to you, but airplanes need to land, right? They need to refuel. And because they need to land and refuel, what do these airplanes need? Fighter jets and helicopters, what do they need? Mike's up. Give me a guess. What do we need here?
Some either a carrier or a base.
Yeah, you need air bases, right? And carriers, you can do that, but carriers will only get you so far, right? You need air bases all over the country. But then you need people to guard the air bases. And so you need to bring in soldiers to guard the air bases. So you need people to guard the helicopters, and then you need people to guard the guards. And then you need people to guard the guards that are guarding the guards. And slowly but surely, we back into Vietnam. This is how it starts. And this is where we have to talk about the draft, because we don't live in a world where the draft exists. But I don't know if you guys noticed this, but when you signed your form to accept your financial aid money, you did agree that in times of draft, you would willingly go to war. I don't know if you guys caught that fine print in your financial aid document. If not, maybe go give it a skim again. But yes, you all agreed to be part of the draft if it's the selective service. I have aged out, but you guys are definitely still on the hook for it. Yes, the draft was a thing after World War II. After World War II, and it was just summer camp at that point for after World War II. It was just like you would go through basic training, and you would be a reservist for a couple months, and that would be the end of your draft. But then Vietnam happens, and it becomes clear that this is not going to be summer camp. And you have to bear in mind that in all of this, new president, now we talk about Kennedy. And Kennedy, remember what I said last time. We associate Kennedy with certain things. We associate Kennedy with things like Medicare, Social Security, civil rights, all of these wonderful things. For sure, they're part of his legacy. But Kennedy doesn't run on those things. Kennedy runs in the 1960 election on being the Cold Warrior. He's the guy that's going to punch Khrushchev in the face and, meet Khrushchev's rhetoric where it lay by being as aggressive as possible. And that means not giving up in Vietnam. That means doubling down on Vietnam. But things are happening with Kennedy in the early part of the 1960s that we talked about, the Berlin crisis, the Cuba crisis. And Kennedy, over the course of his first term, becomes clear to him that it's not going to be the strategy of sort of being just as belligerent as Khrushchev and meeting fire with fire means that we're going to bring about the end of the world. And so by 1963, you have a much more measured Kennedy, but still sort of managing the Vietnam War, this early stage of the Vietnam War, where we're sending people in. Let's be clear, this is still a hot war, but it is not the kind of war that we think about when we talk about, like, when we think of Vietnam. We don't think of Vietnam under Kennedy because that's not where it escalates. In fact, there are some leaked documents about the Kennedy administration where he's privately, I think he's telling either his brother, more on that on Thursday, or his other brother, Ted Kennedy, about hypothetically pulling out of the war in a second term. You know, he needed to win re-election, so he needed to run on the war, like, yes, 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 but then as soon as he had won re-election, he was going to consider pulling out. But as we know, Kennedy takes a trip to Dallas, and he is replaced by Lyndon Johnson. Now, Johnson is very much the anti-Kennedy. Part of this is intentional, right? Kennedy intentionally picked someone as his vice president who is very much not like him, so that they could sort of be a foil to one another. Think like Barack Obama, Joe Biden, like very different people, but could play off of each other rather nicely. Or, you know, understand, like, this is understandable, right? But because Johnson is the anti-Kennedy, he approaches things rather differently. Johnson, if you remember, those same undersecretaries we talked about when we talked about the Eichmann trial, right? Those people who worked in the Obama White House once told me Johnson has the likability of an enema. He is not a he's not a particularly likable man. He's not a he lacks that political sense that Kennedy has. Let's put it that way. But to his credit, Johnson views it as his sort of moral obligation to continue and complete the projects that Kennedy started. And on some things, this leads to wonderful change in the United States. All of the projects left unfinished that we associate with Kennedy's legacy, civil rights, Medicare, Social Security, the Great Society, as we call it in broad terms, those are actually all projects that Johnson gets through the House and Senate and signs. They're part of Kennedy's platform, and so we associate them with Kennedy. But think about it. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If Kennedy dies in 63, that's technically Johnson's accomplishment, but we associate it with Kennedy. Johnson's sort of dogged approach of, I owe it to my dead president to continue these projects, I will finish what you started, leads to all of these great things, but also means that he's not going to accept anything other than not just stalemate in Vietnam. He wants victory in Vietnam, which leads to a bit of a question. What is victory in Vietnam? What does victory look like? I mean, we're there to support our ally who is there, being invaded by these enemies, literally foreign and domestic. What's a victory in that war? Like the parameters for what winning is are not clear. They're not obvious. It's not obvious what victory looks like. And for the most part, especially as soon as he comes to power and wins election in 1964, bear in mind, he wins the 1964 election in one of the biggest blowouts in American electoral history, partially because he's running on Kennedy's legacy. As soon as he has the mandate, he decides that he's going to win Vietnam by throwing men at the problem. This means expanding the draft. And part of why Vietnam has such an outsized role in American culture is because chances are you all know someone that fought in Vietnam. Just statistically speaking, you know at least one person that fought in Vietnam. In terms of age group, in terms of how many Americans served, chances are you know someone that fought in Vietnam. All right? So again, this is what I mean when I say unit force is a lot less like history past and more like history present. This is what I was talking about. In order to expand the draft, we're talking from a small amount of people that were required to go overseas for a couple weeks to a enormously, incomprehensibly large amount of people forced to go to Vietnam for years. You know, we're talking from a couple hundred a month to several thousand per week. You know, this is the level. We're talking an enormous expansion of the draft. Now, for as long as the draft existed, people tried to get out of it. People wanted to get out of going to Vietnam. And there are a couple of ways that you could do it. The first is Canada. Got a friend in Canada? Sleep on his couch for a couple until you're 26 and get out of the draft. That was the first one. One of my professors in college got out of Vietnam in that way. He went to live with his uncle in Vancouver until he was 26. The second is to essentially pay a doctor to certify that you had some sort of something wrong with you, whether it's any sort of like recurring medical condition that would keep you from fighting. The third was the religious exemption. People like Quakers and the Amish could say, oh, well, it's against my religion. You can't compel me to fight. And so, government can't draft you. The fourth way is self-mutilation. Unfortunately, a lot of people would cut off their own finger if they were in danger of being drafted. Namely this one, the little pinky. Chances are, if you see an older gentleman with a missing pinky finger, chances are this is why. Because people would, get it done, chop, chop, can't go to war, can't shoot a gun. People would often declare themselves to be homosexual when they were not. This is before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, number one. And number two, this is at a time before being out was considered to be something that was socially okay. And so this was a big deal in a lot of society. It meant like cutting yourself off from your family and your friends to avoid going to fight. But the last one, the most important one, and one that most Americans who are drafted take advantage of, is the school exemption. If you're a full-time student, if you're enrolled in college full-time, you could not be sent to Vietnam because you were, considered to be a full-time student. That was your job. Which means that lots of people stay in college until they're 26 years old. So don't feel bad if you're like 21 years old and still in county college, because all of those boomers that get mad at you stayed in college until they were 26. So I think my point is, let's sort of recap this, because what is a feature of college in America that you are acutely aware of every time you go to student financial aid? Is college free in America? It's not, is it? Right? College is not only not free, but it's expensive, right? So in order to avoid the draft, you needed to have enough money to go into college until you're 26 years old. All right. And because of a, immediately post-civil rights America scenario in which we find ourselves, what group of people is less likely to have money in America? While you guys unmute and think about that, I'm going to close that window because papers are flying everywhere. Be right back. Okay. Sorry about that. So, what group in America is least likely to have the money to go to college? Something that unfortunately is still true in America in 2020. Minorities, yes. Nadeshta on YouTube says minorities, yes. People of color. are less likely to have the funds to go to college until they're 26 at least, especially in the 1960s, right? Okay. What about the religious exemption? Now, I don't know about you, but I have yet to meet an Amish person of color, right? I don't think they exist, right? There is no Pennsylvania Dutch African American individuals. Maybe there are, but I have yet to see one, right? Again, also all of the other things require some level of significant income. Like you can't just move to Canada on a whim. You can't just, bribing doctors ain't cheap. Inevitably, what this means is that the force that goes to fight in Vietnam is not representative of America as a whole. But the force that goes to fight in Vietnam tends to be poorer, more non-white, less privileged, and more from rural areas or significantly urban areas. No suburbs, no sort of like working class, more working class, but less like upper class individuals, because people that were upper class could go to college. But the biggest at-risk group, it was called the Summer of Terror, were for people who had graduated high school and were officially 18 years old, but had not started college yet. And this is how recruiters will get people. Because essentially for those 2 to 3 months between high school ending and college starting, you were at risk. It was at risk. And a lot of the movements start, the student movement and the civil rights movement, start as protesting against Vietnam. The civil rights movement and the student movement are linked to Vietnam like this because they're both protesting the fundamental injustice of this draft. Most people that we associate with civil rights, Dr. King and Malcolm X, start out, get national media attention as being Vietnam War protesters because they recognize that the people that are being sent to Vietnam are less likely to look like me and more likely to look like them. And that's the problem. And that is the issue. And they are fighting and dying for a country that will not recognize their fundamental rights as American citizens. Hence the problem. It is a sentiment most eloquently encapsulated by Muhammad Ali, who famously, when being given the draft, protested it and said, "Ain't no Viet Cong ever call me the N-word," for example. But similarly with the student movements start actually in our neck of the woods. They begin at Columbia, but Rutgers University and Princeton are also like large hubs of anti-Vietnam War sentiment. Because there's a lot of people in these universities that have friends and siblings who have not started school yet and that are at risk or worse will be drafted. They have gotten the notice in the mail that they're going to Vietnam. And so, the problem with the draft under Johnson is all of these things, but it is fundamentally its scale. It is the sheer number of people. And it becomes apparent that the strategy is not working, that it is not going to be enough for him to just throw men at the problem. It's going to require more. Never mind, put yourself in Johnson's shoes. He didn't want to go to war in Vietnam. This is something that both he and Kennedy had inherited from Eisenhower. And there was sort of no way out. They had no options. They could stay in the war and lose it and lose face with the American people and make, embarrass the American people and present an out for the Soviets to take over Southeast Asia. Or they could stay in and send hundreds of thousands of young people like you and me to their deaths. And they decide to go for the latter. And when it becomes clear that just aiding the South Vietnamese government isn't sufficient, they decide to go all in. This is an event called the Tonkin Gulf Incident. And what they do is they park a couple warships in Vietnam. The Tonkin Gulf is, let me see if I can't pull up that map.
Northeast.
Here we go. The Tonkin Gulf is right here on this map where it says North Vietnam, where this armpit between Vietnam and China. And he parks warships there. And in the middle of the night, he starts taking pot shots into North Vietnam. It doesn't say anything. And when this North Vietnamese retaliate, he goes to Congress and says, aha, unprovoked attack. You see, they hate us. You need to give me authorization to go to war. And so they do. The president goes to Congress and gets authorization to begin the Vietnam War in earnest. And now this is a regular war. Now this is, American soldiers against North Vietnamese army members and the Viet Cong. Now, this is sort of a unique thing in American history because it forces lots of working class white kids that grow up in, and let's be honest here, oftentimes very racist households, to fight alongside African American counterparts. And the irony, I think, of the Vietnam War is that the Vietnam War, it's galvanizing people against it and getting people on the side of civil rights, also sort of cures a lot of racist sentiment amongst individuals fighting in Vietnam, because they have to get along. The racism has to be left at the door because otherwise you're both going to die. If you haven't seen Forrest Gump, which is, if you haven't seen Forrest Gump, what the hell are you doing? But the friendship there is between Forrest and Bubba, and that's an example of the director takes inspiration from real stories that happen. Only people that are far less privileged than Forrest Gump in that instance. And it gives you this idea of these people coming home and viewing things a lot less pun completely not intended, black and white as they had seen it before. But there's another element here, the element that we have not spoken about, and that is television. We talked about television rather briefly in our last class, sorry, not in our last class, in the Eichmann class. But the rise of the television truly changes how Americans experience the war. Because now for the first time, you have every single living room in America with this little porthole to the world. And every night at 6, the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite, get on the news and inform the public of what had happened in Vietnam. And when the public starts to see what's going on in Vietnam, attitudes begin to change. Because remember what I asked before. What is victory in Vietnam? Well, here is how they calculate it. They calculate it through casualties. So let me give you an example. Let me see if I can't, hold up. 1 minute, my friends. Stop sharing and whiteboard. Let me see if this works. First time trying this. Okay, you guys should all see a little whiteboard thingy. Let me try drawing Vietnam extremely poorly. Yada, 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 yada. From memory, kind of. All right, and let's say the border is here. What do? They essentially divvy up the country into quadrants. They basically form a grid over the map. And each of these quadrants is given a name. P1, P2, like almost like a most perverse game of Battleship. And it becomes a game of whack-a-mole. Because bear in mind, with the exception of the major urban centers and individual villages, most of Vietnam, especially rural Vietnam, is jungle, right? There are no roads there. There are no landmarks there. It's predominantly jungle. And that works to the Viet Cong's advantage, which means that if you get information that the Viet Cong is here, right, and you go bomb this place, well, then the Viet Cong moves here, and then you bomb. It's like this perverse game of whack-a-mole that they're playing. But of course, you get scenarios in which, go back to the PowerPoint, you have soldiers fighting over these hills. They're not so much called quadrants, but they're sort of based on these, hills that are can be seen in the jungle, right? So they're identifiable. What you would get is, let's say you would get incidences of, you get reports, oh, the Viet Cong is on this hill. And so you send in the air support and you send in the soldiers, and they fight all day and they take the hill, taking casualties, losing lives. And you capture like 3 prisoners who can't speak any English and are only fighting because the United States bombed their village. And then the soldiers are airlifted away, and a day later, those Viet Cong are right back. And this is what I mean to say. What does victory look like in Vietnam? You have these stories of, let's talk about the villages, because the villages are really emblematic. Because the Viet Cong especially were a guerrilla fighting force, they lived among the civilian population, which means that, when you saw the American soldiers come by, they would take pot shots at them and then hide amongst the civilian public. And so what would the Americans do? Well, they wouldn't take any risks, so they would either bomb or burn the village down. You hear these stories about the napalm being used in Vietnam. This is what it's used for. I highly recommend, it is on the syllabus, and when we do in-person classes, we do watch it in class. I don't know if I'm sure you've heard of these, the CNN documentaries, like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, right? I don't know if the 60s is still on Netflix, but if you have a cable account, it should be available on the CNN app. Watch the 60s episode on Vietnam, because it's truly emblematic of how it's fought and sort of the stories that come out of Vietnam, and the scale of human tragedy as all of these soldiers that go to Vietnam and come home dead. We talked about World War I, about how futile it was. This is the war that comes closest to that, because Eisenhower begins to calculate. Says, okay, here's how we can say that we're winning in Vietnam. We can say, all right, we will calculate victory in Vietnam by how many more Viet Cong and enemy combatants we are killing compared to American casualties. How many Vietnamese are we killing per American who dies? And the number is incredibly large, because America has, all of these advanced armaments versus guys with AK-47s in the jungle. Of course, pardon my French, no shit, right? That America, these numbers are tremendously inflated. And so the president can go in front of the press and say, yeah, well, we've killed 4,000 Viet Cong for every American casualty. But it turns out that the American people don't care about the 4,000, they care about the 1. And so every time the American soldiers come home in caskets, that's one less supporter for the war. And very, very quickly, again, because of scale, right? Here's an analogy that will seem apt given the coronavirus times. This is a lot like a virus. This is a lot like a pandemic in that it spreads, right? For every young person that comes home in a body bag, it's like a small nuclear bomb set off in these individual neighborhoods. Because people of color, people that were fighting the war all the way back in the 1950s, they'd been against the war from the beginning. But how does middle America turn against the war? Because they see on TV that perhaps unlike World War II, where they were sometimes literally the good guys, you see a different side of the war. They see a side of the war that they'd really never allowed themselves to see, but they had always been there, right? War is hell. All war is hell. But now the American public, all of the American public, could see the atrocities that happen in war. Compare that with either their own kid or the kid they knew down the street coming home dead from the Vietnam War. Attitudes begin to change. It is incredible how quickly Johnson goes from the most beloved president in America to the most hated man in America. In like a matter of a year and a half, we go from Johnson winning the largest electoral victory in the history of America to people actively protesting in places like Kent State. Again, this is an example of the student movement. People protesting Vietnam, and unfortunately, many of these young people would be shot at here at Kent State. But people are protesting in DC, people are protesting against the war all over the country. And this kind of breaks Johnson, because Johnson didn't want the war, but he also felt obligated to the war. It was not Johnson that was running the war was running Johnson. And because of that, as we're going to see on Thursday, and I guess almost a part 2 to this lecture, Johnson famously announces in March of 1968 that he would not seek and would not accept the nomination of his party for another term as president. He's done. He does not want any more part of this. And it's a tragedy, I think, because, again, without Vietnam, if we had left Vietnam at the door, Johnson would be considered one of the greatest presidents of American history, just in terms of accomplishments, right? Here's a president that got civil rights passed, that made Medicare as we know it, that made Social Security as we know it, that expanded rights to for people with disabilities, who accelerated the space program all throughout his presidency, so that a year after he steps down from office, we send a man to the moon. That's all Johnson. But we ignore that because Johnson's legacy is joined at the hip with the tragedy of Vietnam. Now, a note on Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon would take over the war after he wins election in '68. Nixon views it as his obligation to win the peace with honor, because Nixon, like Johnson, was also someone who knew Kennedy, only in this case as a erstwhile presidential rival. But that does not mean that they did not necessarily like each other. The relationship between Nixon and Kennedy reminds me a lot of the relationship between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. People that fundamentally disagree on a lot of things, but don't like actively despise each other. They just happen to disagree. Or actually, no, better it would be Barack Obama and John McCain, Billy John McCain. Because again, these people that disagree on a lot of things, but don't actively dislike each other. Instead, what you get is sort of a follow-up to the Kennedy legacy. All throughout the 1960s, the shadow of Kennedy looms large over the 1968 election. And we'll talk about that in detail on Thursday. And Thursday's class will be a bit of a unique class in that it will be one of the only classes in the course that will be talking about the events of a single calendar year, 1968, in which we talk about how, the events of that year lead from tragedy to more tragedy, and how those things evolve into what is widely considered to be the worst year of American history. So I hope you'll join me for that. Now, here's what we're going to do. People watching on YouTube, I will be ending the YouTube portion of this stream to move to the extra credit discussion of the last movie in the extra credit series, Lord of War. If you are part of the extra credit group, this is your warning to hop back into the Zoom call. And if you are in the Zoom call and you are not part of the extra credit group, here is my warning for you to start hopping off. So I don't suppose anyone has any more questions, right? I think we're good. Understandable, clear? Yeah. All right. Give me a second while I set this up. So just be patient with me for a hot minute. Are part of the extra credit group. I hear me. Warning. I hear my voice. A wonderful, wonderful voice. All right, guys.